I feel like one of the most frustrating things when you're learning a language is realizing that you can actually understand quite a lot, but when you try to speak, your brain suddenly goes back to your native language. You know what you want to say, but you don't really know how to say it yet. So you think about the sentence in your native language, then you try to find the word in your target language and then you put everything together. I had this problem for a really long time when I was learning English. And I think one of the most common pieces of advice that you hear when you're learning a language is that you need to think in your target language, which sounds great, but how are you actually supposed to do that? Because I don't think anyone just wakes up one morning and suddenly starts thinking in Spanish or Korean or Japanese. I certainly didn't. When I started learning English, I was translating almost everything in my head, and at the beginning, I actually think that was completely normal. Your brain has been using your native language your entire life, so obviously you're going to use it as a bridge when you're trying to communicate in a new language. So when people say don't translate, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Translation isn't really the problem. The problem is becoming dependent on translation. Because at some point, you want to be able to say something in your target language without going through your native language first. And that's what I wanted to achieve with English. So I started experimenting with the way I was learning. At first, I thought I had to somehow force myself to think in complete English sentences, but that didn't really work. I would sit there thinking, okay, now I'm going to think in English. And then, obviously, I would immediately start thinking in French about the fact that I was trying to think in English. So I stopped trying to force it. Instead, I started much smaller. I focused on really simple words and expression that I used all the time. Things like, okay, wait, I think maybe, or I don't know. They are not particularly impressive. They're not the kind of vocabulary that makes you feel like you suddenly reach an advanced level, but I think that's exactly why they were useful. Because these are the kind of expression that you use without really thinking about them in your native language. And little by little, the same thing started happening in English. I didn't have to think about how to translate I don't know anymore. I just knew it. Then it happened with other little expression, and after that, I started noticing that I could put a few of those things together without translating every single word. It wasn't suddenly, oh, I'm thinking in English now. It was much more gradual than that. First, there were just a few words that came naturally, then short expression, then simple sentences, then eventually I started having thought in English without consciously trying to make them happen. And I think that's when I really started understanding what people mean when they say that you need to think in your target language. Because it's not really something that you decide to do. It happens when you've used the language enough that your brain doesn't need to translate everything anymore. And there is actually a really strange stage in between that I don't think people talk about enough. Sometimes your brain is just mixed. You are thinking in your native language and suddenly a word in your target language appears. Sometimes I even find myself switching between languages without noticing it. And when that happens, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. At least for me, it was actually a sign that the language was becoming more familiar. my brain was starting to create connection directly with the new language instead of always going through French. And the more I used the language, the more often it happened. What helped me the most wasn't trying to sit down and force myself to think in English. It was actually using English for small, everyday things. For example, I would talk to myself. I would describe what I was doing. If I was making something to eat, I could just think about what I was doing in English. If I was watching a video, I could react to it in English. If something happened during the day, I could try to explain it to myself in English. Sometimes I would even repeat the same situations. And yes, it can feel a little bit silly when you're talking to yourself in another language, but it helped me a lot because you're basically giving your brain opportunities to use the language without having to wait for a real conversation. And I think that's important for communication too, because if you never speak out loud, when you're actually having a conversation with someone, you're going to have a lot less practice. But if you're starting to use the language in these small situations throughout the day, eventually some of those sentences become automatic. And when something becomes automatic, you don't need to translate it anymore. I also noticed that listening played a huge role in this. The more English I listened to, the more familiar certain expression became. At first, I would hear a sentence and think about what every word meant. Then, after hearing similar sentences again and again, I started understanding the whole expression without really analyzing it. And I think that's another important part of thinking in a language. You don't necessarily think in individual words. You start thinking in expressions and ideas that you've heard so many times they just feel natural. That's also why I don't think you should be worried if you're still translating everything right now. I know it can feel frustrating, especially when you understand quite a lot but speaking still feels slow. But if you're at that stage, it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It just means that your brain hasn't built enough of those automatic connections yet. And that takes time. For me, the biggest realization was that I didn't actually decide one day to start thinking in English. I just noticed that I was doing it. One day I was thinking about something completely unrelated to language learning, and I realized that the thought was in English. I hadn't translated it. I hadn't tried to make it happen. It just happened. And I remember thinking that it was actually strange because I had spent so much time trying to figure out how to stop translating, and eventually I stopped without even noticing. So thinking in your target language is really more of a result than a starting point. You don't need to wait until you can think in a language before you start using it. You use the language, you listen to it, you speak it, you see the same expression again and again, and eventually your brain starts doing more of the work for you. So if you're still translating in your head right now, don't worry about it. I wouldn't try to completely eliminate translation. Instead, start paying attention to the little things that you can say or understand without translating. Maybe it's one expression, maybe it's a few basic sentences, maybe it's something that you've heard so many times that you don't even think about the meaning anymore. Those little things are actually really important, and then little by little, you will probably notice that there are more and more of them. I think that's how it happened for me. It wasn't one big change, it was just that every few months I noticed that I was translating a little less than before, and then one day I realized that I was already doing something that I had spent years trying to achieve. So be patient with yourself. your brain is learning how to do something it has never had to do before, and eventually the language starts becoming less like something you're translating and more like something you're simply using. Thank you for watching, and if you're learning a language right now, do you already think in your target language, or are you still translating most things in your head? Let me know in the comments. In the next video, I can talk about what I actually like watching in my target languages to improve my listening, because I think choosing the right content makes a really big difference. Okay? See you next week. Bye bye!